Good morning. Good morning. My name is Lauren Reese, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Wilson Center, and especially our partners in the Latin America program, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's event. For those of you joining a Wilson Center event for the first time, I'll say just a quick word about us. The Wilson Center is a living memorial to President Wilson. We are mandated by Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. We have about 15 different programs at the Wilson Center covering every corner of the globe and today's most pressing issues. It's my privilege to direct the Environmental Change and Security Program, which really focuses in on this intersection of environment, climate, population, and health, and looking at that intersection in the context of foreign policy and international development and security. Part of the Wilson Center's mandate is scholarship. Actually, a big part of the Wilson Center's mandate is scholarship. And so we are very pleased today to feature two of our scholars. Jojo Nem Singh is joining us from Amsterdam, where he is a global fellow with the Wilson Center. And then we have Diego van Vacano, who is a scholar in residence this year. So I'm going to provide just a brief introduction and then turn it over to Jojo, who will give us more of a deep dive into his book. And then we'll get into a discussion. So let's see. First of all, let me introduce our speakers. Jojo Nem Singh is a global fellow at the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center, and an assistant professor of international development at the International Institute of Social Studies, part of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. He's the principal investigator of a European Research Council starting grant for a 5-year research project titled Green Industrial Policy in the Age of Rare Metals, a trans-regional comparison of growth strategies in rare earths mining, GRIP-ARM for short. Jojo has also worked as a consultant with UNDP Brussels, and Publish What You Pay in London. In July, he published Business of the State, Why State Ownership Matters for Resource Governance, which is why we are all here today. Diego van Vacano is a fellow with the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and Latin America program, and a professor of political science at Texas A&M University's Bush School of Government and Public Service. His research focuses on the geopolitics and ethics of lithium in Latin America for emerging energy sectors. He's currently working on a book on Bolivia's lithium resources and the politics around their development titled Power Over Energy, Lithium, Bolivia, and the Global Struggle for the New Green Economy. So Jojo's book really explores the role of state ownership in managing natural resources and how it influences governance and development outcomes. The book argues, you can correct me, actually I'm quoting you, so you shouldn't correct me because it says it in the book. The book argues that SOEs, when subjected to corporate governance reforms aimed at harnessing competition and attuned with private sector performance, might open new pathways for technological innovation and support industrial policy. The book is particularly timely at this moment as we see increased demand for critical minerals and rare earth elements that are so critical to the renewable energy transition, as well as defense and manufacturing and digital technologies. We've experienced the vulnerability of supply chains through COVID and Russia's incursion into Ukraine. And as the temperature rises between the US and China, China's role as a dominant global supplier of critical minerals has made its way into discussions of strategic competition. But importantly, this is also an opportune moment for mineral-producing countries, many of which are located in the global south, to harness the global demand for their resources in ways that drive development and support industrial policy. But as we know from the past, there are a lot of pitfalls on the way. So how can we move forward in a more effective, sustainable, prosperous, equitable way? Okay, Jojo, I'm going to turn it over to you to present the book. Thank you.
Is that working now?
Yes.
Okay. How many minutes I have? 15 maximum? Yeah. All right. So we'll try to get everything done in 15 minutes. 300 pages. All right. Let me start by just giving you an overview of what we're going to go through today. I'll focus on the main questions of the book, why I wrote it, the general strategy, and then some of the interesting comparisons that I draw out from the two cases, and then some brief conclusions. So basically, the book is a 3-part book. The first part is an overview, the theory, and historical analysis of public enterprises and generally mineral states in Latin America. The second part of the book is the meat of the book, where I look into the two cases, Brazil and Chile, And the chapters are particularly structured in a way where the first chapter of each country looks at the regulatory framework, the policy, the important debates on legislations, mining, revenue allocation, R&D, etc. The second chapter of the book, the second chapter of each country case, is then focused on corporate governance reforms and the challenges of how to maintain public enterprises. So in the case of Chile, I'm looking at Codelco, and in particular, this chapter focuses on the challenge of maintaining social peace in the labor mines, conflicts between public and private mining, and generally how Codelco navigates very difficult reforms in the context of its political role vis-a-vis and its relationship with the Chilean government. The second case, or the second chapter of the Brazil case, it's actually what delayed the book by at least 3 years, is about Petrobras and the scandal that happened in Brazil, the Lava Jato scandal, corruption, and the extent to which Petrobras was involved in it, the implications to the company, but more importantly, the ways in which Petrobras managed the challenges in the oil and gas industry. I'm going to talk in a little bit why that's important. Apart from the fact that it is about corruption, and we think resource scarce leads to corruption and rent seeking, one of the things I point out in that chapter on Petrobras is the role of the autonomy of the company in navigating pressures externally and internally, and having to successfully build reforms around that is important to its success. And then finally, I broaden the comparison beyond Brazil and Chile, where I look into Peru and Venezuela, as well as the return of the so-called the return of state capitalism in the context of China, and how China implicates the resource sector globally and in Latin America. So it kind of gives you a round off and goes beyond the case studies, the final 2 chapters. I do start in the book, as you always do, you have to sell something. I sold the book by saying, well, suddenly we now talk about clean energy. We think green energy transition is really important, but that transition requires exponential increase, intensive and extensive extraction of natural resources. And so moving to a fossil fuel to a renewable energy system requires mineral-intensive countries to participate in globalized supply chains. So China, Africa, and Latin America are playing an important role in the energy transition. They're going to play an important role as we move on and roll out green electrification, production electric vehicle cars, building new wind turbines, etc., etc. But one of the most important points I raise is that in some countries, this is not going to be led by the private sector. It will be public enterprises. And that's the case of Brazil and Chile. Public enterprises are significant for clean energy transition because, well, to move from fossil fuel to renewable energy, you will need to reform these public enterprises, particularly if they're oil and gas. But, in the case of Codelco, because it's a copper company, it will play a significant role in terms of how to proceed in terms of the pace and the scope of mineral extraction in the next 2 to 3 decades. So if that's important, if we think public enterprises in some Latin American contexts and elsewhere will be significant, we do need to know what makes public enterprises work and how are they effective. And so the key question that I framed the book is around the need to reform these public enterprises as we proceed and move towards a more globally integrated market economy. So one of the most important findings of the book is, contrary to the general trend in Latin America, I pointed out one significant divergence of Brazil and Chile vis-a-vis the rest of the region. And that is the consolidation of a public enterprise-led growth strategy. Between 1980s and 2000, we often associate public enterprises with rent-seeking, corruption, resource curse. But these 2 cases are emblematic examples of how public enterprises not only could survive liberalization, but they actually thrived because they became competitive with the private sector. And that example is really important because there is a whole conversation taking place around the return of state capitalism, the rise of sovereign wealth funds, the importance of state ownership in strategic industries. So this whole debate on whether you think about the Second Cold War, China's rise, all of this, the underpinning logic there is that there is an emerging alternative model of capitalism. How we characterize that is debatable, but the fact is that's something that you can historically demonstrate as well outside of East Asia because you have case studies like this in Latin America. So the main questions I then ask is if we think that market reforms are good, why is it that it was very hard to privatize Petrobras and Codelco and generally some public enterprises in strategic industries? If public enterprises are considered to be conduits and vessels of rent-seeking and corruption, why has it been very tough to privatize them? What are the political economy dynamics that explain the survival of these companies? But more importantly, if we accept the premise that these public enterprises are going to stay, what type of alternative strategies are available for mineral-producing states? So that's the basic framing of the book. Now, the start of the book is the case selection, why I chose these two cases. The first point is, a lot of us talk about green industrial policy, state capitalism, as if it's a question of policy design. The book's claim is it isn't. It's about the historical accumulation of institutional capabilities. It's about building political and economic institutions that work. And so these are two exceptional cases in which centralization of the state occurred and that there was a gradual process of building competitive domestic enterprises. These two state enterprises played a very important role in building what I call a resource-based industrial policy in Brazil and Chile. And the focus there is promoting sectoral development, maximizing revenues, and building economic linkages between the resource sector and beyond. So to understand why it's possible for some countries to do this, the main point here is we need a wider lens, a wider political economy lens that understands the complexity of the state. And that's why in the book I talk about state-state relations as opposed to traditional state-business relations or state-civil society relations. So the focus is about unpacking the state, the complexity of it, the different actors that are involved in building corporate governance reforms in the public enterprise sector. So again, going back to Lauren's introduction, the main argument of the book is if you compel these companies to perform at par with private enterprises, they may actually respond positively and therefore be able to perform as effective as the private sector. The historicization of public enterprises is important because it allows us to understand a new development actor, a new agency in the debate of political economy of resource-led development. Why do states avoid privatization as a starting point? The main argument is it really depends on how the compatibility and the institutional arrangement look like prior to privatization. So historical antecedents matter. If you have a very strong public enterprise, it's very likely that you will keep the public enterprise and avoid complete privatization. So that is what would explain Brazil and Chile vis-a-vis, let's say, Bolivia and Argentina that went on a full-blown privatization of the resource sector. In that process, if you accept the premise that in some cases public enterprises are unlikely to be privatized, so the development strategy would be very different. And this is what I would call a hybrid development strategy. What I simply mean here is the states actively build growth strategies that combine market and state mechanisms. They attract private investment, they try to attract foreign investment, so that's the regulatory side of the policy, but then they maintain public enterprises so that they can be competitive actors vis-a-vis the private sector. So that's why it's a hybrid development strategy responding to globalization, maintaining some kind of state activism vis-a-vis a framework, a policy framework in which it's still very open and attracts private investment, in particular foreign direct investment. So that's fine if we think of very broadly, this is what makes Brazil and Chile interesting together. But these two cases by themselves are also quite different. And so the book kind of takes you from this is why these two cases are interesting comparison vis-a-vis Latin America to let's look at Brazil and Chile and individually what has happened to these different companies. So my main argument is it depends on the governance model. In the case of Chile, it has embraced the privatization model much more thoroughly than any other Latin American country. So the public enterprise Codelco had to deal with the fact that it has a government, it historically had this government that kept on pushing for privatization, and so it had to maintain political autonomy in order for it to be competitive. So it's actually a state enterprise within a very neoliberal economic system. By contrast, in Brazil, there is a long history of developmentalism. The state routinely intervenes, the state routinely builds and supports public enterprises. So in the case of Petrobras, the problem was that it was very close to the government and it needed to distance itself from the state. Part of what I talk about, explaining the Lava Jato scandal, for example, a lot of that had to do with the fact that there was so much intervention coming from the government vis-a-vis the public enterprise. So the issue for Petrobras was to create that distance with the state, whereas the issue for Codelco was to also create distance from the state, but to assert itself in a system in which the government wants to privatize the economy. So some of the most interesting comparisons, I think, is there are similar conditions between these two countries, but they basically diverge in terms of the strategy, in terms of how they would respond to pressures of globalization. So in the case of Chile, the problem was that it had to respond to a logic of privatization, so it had to keep defending itself. In the case of Brazil, it had to defend itself to attain autonomy from the national government. And that's why I think the significance of this is that state enterprises, although generally are important, they function very, very differently across the cases. In the case of Chile, for example, the idea was that you need to have a strong autonomous public enterprise, but you need to maintain a very pro-FDI, pro-foreign investment regulatory framework. In the case of Brazil, you needed a strong public enterprise that is intrinsically autonomous in a public policy setting where the state is pushing for more government intervention. So the state companies perform very, very different functions in these two different political settings. I identified 3 key roles for the state company, and it differs between Codelco and Petrobras. The first is, if you have a public enterprise, one of its main functions is to maximize revenues in the resource sector. So if you compare that to Peru, Peru's main mechanism for revenue acquisition is through taxation. If you have a public enterprise, essentially that's a direct contribution to the national government, apart from the royalty taxes, apart from your taxation mechanism. So it creates possibilities to enhance productivity within the sector because basically you maximize revenues from the resource sector. The second is, under certain circumstances, if the state deems that it's important to have a public enterprise that has technological innovation, public enterprises can then develop capacities to build supply chains. So in the case of Petrobras, it moved from, ironically, midstream downstream, so basically the petroleum derivative sector, to upstream, which is oil exploration. And this is particularly important for Brazil because they didn't have oil until 2007. So the public enterprise existed without oil. Its political mandate was to ensure energy security. It was never to find oil until they found oil in 2007, and then that has changed. And of course, the story of Lava Jato fits in terms of the resource rents being accrued in the new oil reserves. The other point is, because Brazil has a tradition of industrial policy, Brazil also experimented to extend and go beyond the oil and gas industry. One of the big difference between oil and mining is that the oil and gas industry should be seen as a capital-intensive sector. We often think of mining as we often think mining, there's not much technological innovation because there's no other sectors that you can build from it. Whereas in oil and gas, you can go in different directions. Oil and gas is a matter of energy security. It's a national security question. So there are many ways in which the state could use industrial policy to develop new industries from it. Finally, one of the most significant contribution of Petrobras is in R&D. It basically developed new technologies in order for them to extract oil. Petrobras, if it did not invest in offshore underwater sea drilling, Petrobras would not have the ability to take that oil out from offshore, from Rio de Janeiro. So R&D contribution was significant. There is an obligatory legislation in Brazil that forces oil companies to spend on R&D, and that's what really built this in. This is really what built technological innovation in the oil and gas sector in Brazil. One of the most interesting data point here actually is Brazil's Petrobras has one of the biggest, if not the biggest, carbon capture programs, and that was funded by the R&D. And it also has the cheapest extraction cost at the moment. So Peresal is actually quite cost effective, and that's why they're not going to move away from oil and gas anytime soon, because they are competitive vis-a-vis other oil producers. So the issue is when you don't have state ownership, what happens? In the case of Peru, what happens was that they have basically just used taxation as a means to extract revenues, but they didn't really maximize that revenue, and they don't really maximize the impact, the potential impact of their mining industry in terms of broad economic development. In the case of Venezuela, it's opposite. It's when the state is left unchecked, it tends to make the company uncompetitive. It makes the company a vessel of rent seeking. So, as you know, that long story is all about Chavez strengthening state control at the expense of the competitiveness of the company. So in conclusion, some of the most important points, I think, is that we need to pay attention to state ownership, but we need to historically understand how state ownership emerged in countries, in resource-producing countries. We will then figure out whether privatization is an option for them, and if not, there are alternative strategies available. In particular, Brazil and Chile are important cases that shows alternative strategies, hybrid development strategies, combining market mechanisms with state mechanisms to maximize the impact of the resource industry. And finally, because we are talking about the return of state capitalism, the book basically is making a point where, yeah, it's not just China. There's a lot of state ownership models. There's the Middle Eastern countries as well, there's African models of state ownership. So we need to pay attention to the specifics and the nuances of these public enterprises. And I think I'll stop with there.
Thank you, Jojo. Before I turn over to Diego, I just want to remind our viewers online that you can submit questions via the chat box below the video that you are watching. And I encourage you to do so because we will have a portion of the discussion set aside for Q&A with the audience. Diego.
All right, thank you very much. This is a great pleasure to be here because Jojo's book, I think, is a really exciting book. I think it's something that's going to be able to potentially change a lot of the frameworks around political economy and development studies and also industrial policy in the developing world, especially Latin America. So I think before I begin to make some comments, I wanted just to underscore the fact that Jojo's book, I think, is going to have a really big impact. It can have a big impact because of the trajectory of development studies. I think, as Jojo correctly states in the book, over the last many decades, actually, has been underestimating the role of the state and overemphasizing the role of privatization, especially, of course, in Latin America, but I would say in many other parts of the world. And it's a little bit surprising because even for me, being from Bolivia, when I read the book, I kept thinking about Bolivia, which I think that's something that's very interesting about the book, is that even though it's not about Bolivia, it makes you think about how to apply the ideas of this particular book to different countries, different cases. And Peru, of course, Venezuela are explicit cases in the book, but as I was reading it, I was reminded of the 1970s in Bolivia and the 1980s. Every decade had a particular ideology and also institutional framework that in some way was very similar to what Jojo was discussing. So I think it's interesting how the book is really changing the way that we should think about development studies. We think about people like, let's say, Paul Collier and Jeffrey Sachs, who for many, many years were advocating privatization, neoliberalism, and they've changed their tune over the last few years. And it's interesting how, why that may have happened, but one way to understand it is that we've really underestimated the role of state SOEs in development. And I think that's the kind of the bigger picture that I wanted to draw out before I discuss more details of the book, is that we should really think about why is it that Chile, which is seen as Joseph says, as a neoliberal poster child, actually retained the SOE model for Codelco in a very successful way. And this is something that people really don't discuss very often. It's something that we don't really know about, or so in itself, that is a very, very valuable point. But again, the bigger picture is that this can maybe change the trajectory of development studies towards something not necessarily only entirely based on the state, obviously, but more something of a hybrid model. I think it's really important to say that, yes, we live in a globalized environment. The market economy sort of dictates global relations at the economic level, but there are agents that are really much more in the public sector that can really, really make a difference. And I think that's something that we haven't really looked at for many decades. Again, as something that, as I said before, and I think it's really refreshing and something that we really need in development studies. And so that's the one thing I wanted to say initially. The other major point is that I think we have to think about the historical element. I think it's something that, as a political scientist myself, I've done a lot of work on historical problems and ideas. And this book is actually, again, taking us back to historical analysis. And that's something that also development studies doesn't really do very often, because we think about development often as technocratic, purely technocratic or technical issues, right? We think about, okay, what's the result of this particular policy? What are the different options, policy options in a given moment? And very, very specific technical issues, or even almost scientific issues sometimes. And I think that's something that is not entirely correct or useful. We have to think about the la longue durée, as Joseph says. We have to look at the historical development over decades. And that's something that's going to explain why Chile went this way, Brazil went that way, Argentina went a different way. It's really difficult to really use only one single lens for all of these countries in Latin America, even if they're very similar. There's a lot of similarities between the countries, but they each have their own dynamics, their own history. And I think it's really important to look at Jojo's point to say, look, it's a historical problem and it's an institutional problem as well, right? We look at in Jojo's book, I think it's more, the focus a little bit more on the institutional history, the trajectory. And that's something that maybe I would like to push a little bit more to discuss the ideological trajectory of these institutions, because again, coming from a background of political theory and ideology for me, and again, looking at Bolivia, especially thinking about Bolivia, I think the ideology of each country differs very, very much, right? So when I look at the cases of Brazil and Chile, as you rightly said, they're very different. Maybe that's something that I would invite you to discuss a little bit more about the ideological history of each country, which is kind of the framework where these ideas come from. Right? They don't appear out of nowhere. Right? They appear over many, many years, as you say, in the case of Brazil, for example, with the Getulio Vargas period. And that is very different from the Pinochet period in Chile, for instance. Right? So I think I agree with you that the historical analysis is really important, but I think ideology has to play a bigger role in trying to understand why particular countries have different trajectories. So that's one comment that I wanted to initially just set out there. The other, of course, is that, again, as I said, I'm from Bolivia, and the lithium sector, as we discussed earlier, and it's in your book as well, in a sense, could be the future, right? In a way, Chile is looking at lithium as well. The Boric government is trying to develop a state strategy for lithium. And so that would be another area that I would like you to expand on. How can you apply your ideas to the lithium sector generally, of course in Chile specifically, but I'd be interested to see what other countries are going to be doing, Argentina obviously and Bolivia. And if they take different trajectories, I wonder what the factors are. Are they going to be institutional, ideological, and so forth? Another point that Jojo's book makes that's really, really important is that it tells us that we should go back to political science. As a political scientist, obviously I agree. I mean, it's something that we should not purely look at it as a technical problem, but political science can actually help political economy, and political economy can inform economics, and economics can inform technocratic governance, right? So it's a chain, it's a sort of multi-layered process. And so, in the case of mining, for example, lithium, I think it's a really, really complicated case. Bolivia is probably the most complicated case that I can think of. It hasn't really budged in 4 years, but in part because of these many layers that complicate things. And so I think, yeah, I agree with you, political science can provide the tools, the political theory, ideology, political economy. And as you say in the book, it's a lot of the pitfalls in the two cases have to do with politics, right? With internal politics within the state, within institutions, also across institutions, right? Sometimes the oil company might have interests that are very different from the mining state company. That happens in Bolivia all the time between the YPFB, the national oil company, and YLB, the lithium state company. They're at odds, and there's a lot of politics between the two. And of course, the other major political scenario is the geopolitical, which I think is something that maybe you could also expand more on today and in your future work. Obviously, you discussed China a little bit towards the end. So I think maybe discussing China at the beginning a little bit more would have said, look, we have a different scenario globally now, and we have to adjust. We have to adjust because we're no longer in the purely neoliberal stage. China has had a lot of success internationally. Its influence in Latin America is stronger. And so how can we discuss the reaction by the US and Russia as well, and EU, I would think. Those are some of the major players. So the geopolitical, I think, dimension is really also, again, this doesn't disagree with your point that it's a political problem. But I would just urge you to maybe discuss a little bit more the geopolitical, especially the U.S., how the U.S. can, in a way, catch up or in some way regain some of the traction that it's lost in Latin America, especially, right? Not just globally, vis-a-vis China. Obviously, I think it's a very, very difficult challenge for the U.S. competing with China in this sector, especially lithium and critical minerals. But in Latin America, what can be done differently? And I think it's obviously more complicated given that the election's coming next year this year in the U.S. and then many other elections in Latin America, and so that's going to complicate the landscape. But yeah, I think the geopolitical dimension is something that has to be a little bit more examined, and related to that is the interesting discussion you have with East Asia. I think it's as you say, East Asia is another cases where the state actually played a very significant role. I think the U.S., for example, had a bigger role in South Korea in its helping South Korea develop in a way that it maybe should have done in Latin America. Right? It's something that the U.S. could have done something similar in Latin America, which I don't think we can say it did. In many, it's kind of a lost opportunity for the U.S. in that respect. And so the East Asian cases, Japan. It's interesting you mentioned Japan, South Korea. And Taiwan as well, but I would like to hear a little more of a discussion on that. And maybe the last thing which I'll mention briefly is that, and obviously this is part of the chapters on Brazil, is corruption, right? It's corruption. We often, the first thing, as you say, the first word that we think of often when you think about SOEs is corruption. In a lot of the development literature, is that these are breeding grounds for corruption. And whether that's the case in larger countries like Brazil or Mexico, or very small countries like Bolivia, corruption seems to be almost endemic to SOEs. And you discussed the Lava Jato case in Brazil very, very well. But I think it's still not clear how we can justify some of the choices by Petrobras. Given the Lava Jato, corruption case, and how we can actually avoid and sort of try to avoid those problems in the future for countries that are maybe trying to emulate Brazil or Chile. Again, I'm thinking about Bolivia. There's a lot of corruption in the Bolivian case in the lithium sector. How can we avoid and minimize them? And if let's say there's, next year's election in Bolivia, so a new president comes in, what can they do to minimize the corruption. So that, even though you discussed corruption, I was still, I was left a little bit with that question mark. You know, what can we do to avoid it from becoming a huge problem? But, you know, these are just sort of minor clarifications. Overall, I think the book is really, really important. We should really not ignore the bigger kind of picture, which I think is look at the problem historically and to look at the need to focus on hybrid models and not purely on the focus on privatization. So with that, I'll just leave it there and please, you know, hear your comments.
Thank you, Diego. Jojo, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the points that Diego raised. I'm watching the clock. I know we probably have some questions in the room, and I know we have a question online, and I have a couple questions. But let's start with Diego's comments. I mean, I think there, you know, this point about the ideological trajectory, how the ideas that you sort of surface in your book could be applied to the lithium sector, thinking about the geopolitical context, and then how do we deal with corruption?
Okay,
Just a small question. And
Small
if you
questions.
don't mind me adding one more, just sort of thinking about the geopolitical context, but then taking it, you know, one of the things that we like to do here is think about the scales of decision making, right? So how do you engage different levels of decision making from the local all the way to the international and make sure that there's alignment and avoiding sort of unintended consequences across those scales. And so thinking about community engagement. I know in some of the conversations that we've hosted here with, there was a recent one with a panel of lawyers from African countries who are dealing with Chinese investments in their respective countries. And one of the points that came out of that was the need for citizens to be more engaged in ensuring that their leadership is looking out for the best interests of their country, right? So it's not necessary, I mean, a part of it is thinking about how the US and China and others engage in those countries, but ensuring that the country leadership is looking out for the interests of local level, right? So maybe thinking about that in relation also to the geopolitical, right? How do you weigh all these challenges? And that is a lot that I just put in
Yes.
front of you. So we'll see what you can do. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. I will try to do this in as efficient way as possible. Yes, so ideology matters, and I think so one of the earlier drafts of this book actually paid attention to that had to be rewritten. One of the big differences between Brazil and Chile, in fact, is that in the Chilean case, there's an ideological break. So the book starts with talking about the construction of developmental states in Latin America. I mean, it's about Venezuela. Venezuela was there, but also Brazil and Chile. You could even argue Colombia in the 1950s. Where it starts to digress is when Pinochet came to power in, I have to get this right, 1973, September 1973. But what we need to remember is that the nationalization of copper took place in 1971, which is an inter-party consensus. So it would actually not have mattered who was the president at that time. And in the Chilean case, the nationalization took place as a response to the failure of previous attempts to Chileanize the resource industry, the copper sector. And so, in fact, when Pinochet came to power, ideologically he was, he wanted neoliberalism as a social engineering project, but copper was too important for it to be left to the private sector. And in fact, one of the first things he did was to put in place a law in which 10% of the profits of the state company directly financed the armed forces. And that law stayed for 20 more years or so. So ideologically, yes, there has been a shift, but the practical realities of a copper economy like Chile meant that the state actually needed more control rather than less in its most important export sector. In the case of Brazil, there was a lot more continuity because of the centralization of the state. It started with the Varguista state. The military government retained that emphasis on developmentalism. And so the challenge really was how to make Petrobras competitive, despite the fact that it had all the political and economic instruments offered by the national government. So I think that's the important differences between the two cases. And yes, ideologically, that's important. Ideologically, they're different, but the consistency in which the state articulated a social contract, a political contract with the national enterprise that's very clear across the two cases. In terms of how this applies to the lithium sector, of course, one big difference between copper and lithium is that lithium is privately, there's a big private company, SQM, and then you have American company in the Chilean lithium sector. And so the challenge for the Boris government is actually how to manage a sector without without creating fear from the private sector. So it starts from a very different point of view. It starts from a different starting point in terms of state-business relations. Of course, because I've studied copper, I would say the current debate in Chile is actually almost the same situation when the Washington Treaty of 1951 was put in place and the Chilenization del Cobre in 1960. So you can see this almost repeating, the repeat of historical cycle in Chile, in which they start with the question of, do we need to nationalize the resource? What are the conditions in which we can maximize development in this sector? And then there's this whole sort of political process that takes place where they had to start negotiating with foreign companies, with the private sector, and then ended up deciding that the state enterprise model was the best model that works for them. I'm not saying that's the trajectory that will happen in Chile, but I think the political debates in the 50s and 60s are very, very clearly similar debates that's happening now in the lithium sector. So we need to pay attention to that conversation. And of course, that specific conversation, that was a conversation with the American companies. So we have to remember also that the US played a very important role in the copper sector, very, very similar to what's happening now in the lithium sector. Slight difference, of course, is that China owns, I think, 14% of SQM, Tianqi. So that changes a little bit the nature of the private company. The big question on geopolitics, of course. So this is a very complicated question, particularly in the context of the Wilson Center. But I think there's two implications when we think of China and from the point of view of mineral producing states. We can look at the China question from different angles, right? But if I'm a mineral producing state, there's two things I'm gonna get out of this geopolitical picture. One is that what China provided was a model of resource governance. Because for a very long time, we've always said public enterprise-led resource strategies never worked. Then came China, where China began to build supply chains, increase the participation of domestic companies across the supply chain, until the point that we realized, okay, China is way too dominant in the supply chain. That's not going to happen for mineral producing states, because as in a lot of our conversations, when countries think of nationalization of resources, what they actually mean here is increasing the local value the local value added, increasing the participation of domestic companies in the supply chain. So that really effectively means moving from extraction to processing and refining. I don't think you're going to see any other country that's going to be able to replicate the China strategy, simply because of the scale of investment that's necessary to do that. There's just really no country that can match that, not even Japan and Korea. And that leads to the question around scales of decision-making and how do we align all of this. I'm a huge fan of Hirschman and Alice Amsden. So these people, Albert Hirschman, of course, has studied Latin America, but amongst the Latin Americans, I keep saying you should look at Alice Amsden's work, where she talks about principles of reciprocity, how to build social contract between states and domestic capital, but more importantly, I think, how to build domestic champions. And that's really the Taiwanese model. For mining to gain public legitimacy, you basically need to address local industrial development. You basically need employment in the mining industry and the relevant sectors that you're gonna build from the mining sector, whether that's the battery supply chain, it's EV cars, it really doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, the government's main job is to provide employment in whatever form, and any industry that you consider to be strategic, it really needs to do some of that. And I think that's the challenge. The mining industry isn't good at that because it's a capital-intensive industry. That's why, for example, in the case of Petrobras, they wanted shipbuilding, because building ships employ labor. It's the simple fact that, you will have more people employed if you build related industries in the oil and gas sector. So I think this is gonna keep happening. Any conversation about local value addition will have to talk about employment, job opportunities, and how do you create more jobs, even in a sector that traditionally we would consider to be very bad at creating mass employment. The final point is on corruption. Yes, you're right. I think the goal of the book, because there's no English material that has ever been written on, okay, I may get into trouble with this. It is the first book that dealt with corruption, that looked at legal documents, first of all. So we really looked at what Petrobras declared in terms of the level of corruption, who was involved. So we've done all that work. And so the idea is to place the corruption scandal in the wider dynamics of politics in Brazil, why they had a crisis of democracy, why there was a crisis of governance in Brazil after the Lava Jato scandal. But more importantly, what was the scale of corruption such that it impacted the company, and how profound was that impact? The main argument of the book actually is the issue with Petrobras was that there were not enough significant institutional checks and balances. Because the moment they found oil, there was much more government intervention in policies. So it's not so much an intervention on the direct management of the company. That's not the issue. The issue was that Petrobras could not make sound business planning because the board of directors was appointed by the president, and that had profound implications where to build the refining plants, how to build the supply chain, etc. So the issue is, in a country that has embedded corruption, where the political system is susceptible to political corruption, you need to make sure that there are more institutional checks and balances in the public enterprise sector. And in fact, one of the things that Petrobras did was to implement on its own several mechanisms of corporate governance reforms in order to prevent that from happening in the future. But that was only possible because of the ownership structure of Petrobras. So, of course, Petrobras is mostly owned by the national government, by the pension fund, etc. But some part of the non-voting shares of the company, they have to be accountable to the private sector. That's how I got the documents, actually. My lawyer friend said, you should go to the SEC in New York because they're supposed to declare all of these. So that's how I got that data on the corruption scandal. And so that's when I think about when we compel the company to behave as a private company, you create certain mechanisms of accountability, you create certain mechanisms in which corporate governance reforms could be much more thorough, and that maybe would increase the accountability of the public enterprise.
Thank you. Okay, so I know we're at time. We started a little bit late, though, so if you have to leave right at 11, that's okay. But if you want to stay for a few minutes, I think we can go about 5 minutes over. And I'd like to provide an opportunity to hear any questions in the room, and then I know we have one from online. So please let me know. Raise your hand if you have a question, and if you would take a minute to share your name and your affiliation, and then get to your question. Scott.
Thank you. My name is Scott Odell from the MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative. Jojo, thanks so much for this presentation and for your book. Looking forward to reading it. And I unfortunately do have to leave, so I'm sorry to be leaving a little bit before the end of this. But this is a really fascinating project. I'm excited about it, as you know, having heard you discuss a little bit about this earlier. My question relates to differences between the Codelco case and the Petrobras case. I think those are two very interesting cases you chose in the context of the clean energy transition, because in theory, we are trying to transition away from oil and gas towards clean energy, which will depend on copper as a primary metal. But my question is, what sort of differences are there in the materiality of these two? Focus specifically on that materiality aspect. And what that means for the ways in which each sector develops as well. So oil and gas, for example, is more easily consumed domestically. As an end product, it's easier to produce that end product domestically as well. With copper, even if you do the processing domestically, which is decreasingly done in Chile and other countries, it's usually sent to China. Even so, if you reach the end product phase, you're still going to send it to China to be turned into some manufactured good or a solar panel or something else. So I'm curious if you know, in the course of these years of research you did, what sort of insight you gained on that? Are there some specific differences in the supply chains, the materiality of these two things that these companies are looking at or working on that might make comparison either interesting or difficult between a Petrobras and a Codelco?
Yeah.
Thank you, Scott. Any other questions in the room? Okay. Claire, do you mind sharing the question from online? Oh, sorry. Excuse me, sir. Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Robert Kayobyo. I come from Africa, Uganda in particular, and I have just finished my master's in the energy and environmental law. I'm very, very, very proud of Jojo's presentation and the positive criticisms from Diego. Now, the issue here is environmental change. How are you do you have a way of addressing it? Two, you tried to address the issue of corruption, but that is a very big voice, which I don't know how you can try to address it, but also you discussed a bit of the regulations, but you tickled my mind as a lawyer for about 15 years and majoring in natural resources. Then the issue of geopolitical economy. Actually, as we are looking at these nomenclatures, we find that China has really penetrated Africa, and we have benchmarked in Africa. You were talking of social responsibilities, but when it comes to Africa, actually, they bring all sorts of labor from the technical to support. And the community is down there. I'm talking out of experience because I have ever headed a project representing government and I saw what was happening. How are we going to address this at a geopolitical, economic level? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And then one question from online.
So we have a question online from Chiara Balam, who's a graduate student, about the extent to which the insights you shared are transferable to other regions of the globe. So you briefly discussed some other regions and kind of how these insights are relevant, but building on this, to what extent do you see state ownership being able to deliver responsible and development-oriented resource governance in regions outside of Latin America, so for example, mineral-rich countries in Africa, which I know is just brought up in the prior question as well, or are there unique institutions in Latin America that make it a particularly good context for these kinds of dynamics?
Great. So I'm going to ask you for rapid fire responses to those questions, and then Diego, invite any thoughts from you as well before we wrap up. Do you need me to review the questions, or do you have
I think I have
okay.
Scott's question.
Materiality, and then
Materiality,
the environmental
yeah.
impacts, corruption, labor.
Yes.
Okay, and then transferring.
I'll see what I can do. Yeah. So So I think, so I mean, I talked already about the difference between mining and oil and gas, in which, so part of the book also talked about the privatization of CVRD in Vale, which is now we call Vale, which is the biggest iron producer in the world. And I talked about why Vale was privatized and not Petrobras. And I think part of that rationale speaks to the copper industry as well. There is a view from policymakers that mining doesn't get you very far in terms of technological innovation. The exception to this conversation would be South Africa, where they develop a chemical industry, they develop specific engineering capabilities in order for them to solve geological problems. But beyond South Africa, actually, most mining technologies are owned by Canada and Australia. So that by itself makes copper strategic as an export, but not as a tool for industrial development. Whereas in Brazil, historically, the creation of Petrobras, the idea of an oil and gas industry, these were all tied to national security. These were all tied to logics of energy security. So there was always this view that you need to have an oil and gas state enterprise because that's what will get you domestic self-sufficiency. So you don't want to be entirely reliant on overseas markets all the time because then that creates vulnerability and national security concerns. What's interesting, however, with the case of copper in Chile is Chile technically has market power because it produces 35% of the global copper industry. So it moved from 10% to 35%. Within 3-4 decades, it became the dominant copper producer. One could argue it had to do with the reserves, but I think a big part of it is the way they sold the copper industry. So I would have interviews both from the private sector and government saying, what makes Chile special in Latin America, because they always talk about Chilean exceptionalism, is that we are a land of tax and political stability. So this is my favorite line. And the role of the state is subsidiary because our job is to ensure that there's political and tax stability. And that's what it does. That's the role of the government. The public enterprise, Codelco, its job is to produce copper the way the private enterprise does. So I think there's this whole idea that the market power of Chile is imagined rather than real, and Chile would simply export copper. It would refine some of its copper, but it would not do more than that. And I think that's the limitation of the understanding of the role of the public enterprise in Chile. In the case of oil and gas, there's a lot more ambition in terms of industrial policy, energy security. As I said, they have so many programs that were put in place in order to maximize the possibilities for oil-based development. Which leads me to the point around the question around how you address some of all these problems connected to the mining economy, resource scarce, environmental problems, etc. I think the lesson that, if I have to distill one lesson from Brazil and Chile, it would be the fact that what they have been successful in doing is building human capital and domestic professionals. It's very easy for us to forget this, but if you have to keep getting oil engineers from the US just to build an oil refinery, that's a lot of money for the company. You will never have a competitive oil and gas sector. So whatever sector you have, whether it's it's copper, it's lithium, you need to build a professional cadre, a cadre of professionals, state managers, private managers. You need to have expertise, and that expertise goes a very long way. They can move between sectors. They can move, from the mining industry to construction, and then you build the tools that you need for broader industrial development. And I think that to me is the most important part. It's a very simple point, but it's not very easy. It takes decades to do that. Brazil had this program of sending engineers to the US, to Norway to learn how to do oil, how to build refineries, how to participate in equipment and services. That's 3-4 decades of continuously paying for investing on human capital. And not a lot of countries pay attention enough for that. So if you want a lithium industry, at the end of the day, what you want are Chileans and Bolivians and Argentinians actually, having labs, running these labs, investing in new technologies that is Bolivian, that is Chilean, that would be Argentinian. Australia is doing great because of that, because they've always had mining technology. They have a lot of schools. They have a lot of these networks that are built. And I think for future, whatever industry that countries choose to take, whether it's lithium, it's nickel, you need to have human capital. You need to have people being able to participate in these industries. And I think I will stop there.
Thank you, Jojo. Diego, do you want to share any?
Two very quick points which are really connected to what Jojo just said is, I was thinking about exactly the similarities, but also tensions between the oil and gas and mining. Bolivia is a very good case. I mean, again, the NOC in Bolivia is trying to kind of take over the lithium state company. So even though you say there might be some ways to compare in the Brazil and Chile, there's a very strong tension between these two sectors. So that's something that we need to explore much more, how different they are. And the other thing is that R&D, human capital, the case of Petrobras is amazing. For a small country like Bolivia, or even a country like Argentina, which has a very good human development, but it's I think it's going to be very difficult to do what you just said, which is to develop Bolivian or Argentinian experts who are going to be able to do what happened in Chile or Brazil. So that's the other challenge, and maybe that's where the U.S. could participate more, like with universities, for example. So, but those are just some comments on what you just said.
Just a quick point. In Brazil, they had an obligatory R&D law. That was why that sort of process, that's where all it started. Since the 70s, they started investing directly to the R&D. But of course, it's possible because the state enterprise was willing to do that. If it's the private sector, then that's a different conversation.
I'm afraid we're at the end of our time. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for those viewing online. The event will be posted and archived on the event website, and I hope you can stick around for a few minutes if you'd like to talk to our speakers. And thank you to our AV team for their support of today's event. All right, thank you.
Done. First part.